and welcome everyone to another episode of That Catholic Saints Guy. I'm your host, Brian O'Neill, and thank you for joining us. Today, I'm very excited because we have a story that hardly anyone knows, and it's a shame that hardly anyone knows the story because it deals with martyrdom, not only here on the soil of the United States of America, but Florida, which most people don't even realize had a pre-colonial history, or what would be pre-colonial for us. So in any event, today I am joined by an expert on that subject, Dr. Mary Soha. She's a pediatrician from Florida. And before we get going into the story of the martyrs, Doctor, tell us a little bit about yourself, if you would, please.
Well, that's correct. I am a pediatrician, and I got involved, if you would, in martyrdom events back in 1996. I ended up under a picnic table in a rainstorm with Father John Perret, who was the vice postulator for Caterite Caquetha's canonization. And I was talking to him under the picnic table and asked him how her cause was going. And he said, not so well. They couldn't afford a doctor to review the healings and the miracles that were coming in through her intercession. And I said, well, I'm a doctor. I'll do it for free. And in good Catholic fashion, he said, you got the job. So, I got started. I got started with being the doctor on Caterite's cause starting in 1996. And out of that, in 2014, Florida had, in Tallahassee, had their first Catholic history conference that they'd had in many, many years. Okay. And they had historians, archaeologists, theologians from all over the state of Florida to relook at the evangelization of La Florida in the first Spanish period, because new evidence was coming to light to show how devout the Native American people were and how total their catechesis was. I was asked to go and present to this group to talk about my experience with Native American Catholicism, especially with regards to Caterite Caquetha, Saint Caterite, who had died in 1680. So out of that meeting, a handful of lay people did what a king of Spain, a pope, 2 archbishops, and a bishop couldn't do. And that was petition for the opening of the cause of the canonization of these martyrs of La Florida. So it just goes to show it's always in God's time, not ours.
Amen to that. So what is it, as I said at the beginning, a lot of people don't even know there is such a thing as Florida Martyrs. When people think of the North American martyrs, and here's a shameless little plug, as I write about in my book, 150 North American martyrs you should know.
Right. We're going to add to that, aren't we?
Yeah, well, it's fantastic. When people think of the North American martyrs, they think about, St. John de Brebeuf and Isaac Jogues and the Jesuit North American martyrs, who we typically think of as a group. What they don't think about and what they don't realize is that North America, first of all, stretches from Greenland all the way down to basically the beginning of South America. That's considered Central America, the Caribbean. But more to the point, when we typically think about North America, at least we as Americans and Canadians, we're thinking Canada and the United States. And there have been more martyrdoms that have occurred on American soil than any of us had an inkling. And 400 of them were there in La Florida. And first of all, when we think of La Florida, or Florida, as we call it today, what do we normally think of? We normally think of the state, but it was much bigger, wasn't it?
Right. The first Spanish period, Spain considered La Florida all of the east coast of the United States, and going over west to as far as they knew at the time, which would have been Mississippi River, and then going a little bit beyond west of the Mississippi. That's what they considered La Florida. And there's always the caveat, and all lands not yet discovered or not yet known. For La Florida, the geographic boundaries are not as important for Spain, because they saw La Florida as being a territory that had never been exposed to Christianity. They had two main objectives for coming to what we call La Florida. One was to establish a presidio, or a harbor, where they could have their man-of-war ships to go out and protect their shipping lanes from Central and South America going over to Spain. But their second and their greater objective was to have a more perfect catechesis of the native peoples. There had been such a disruption of Catholic catechesis in the Caribbean and Central and South America, not so much because of the efforts of the priests were awry or amiss, but because it was always done in conjunction with the Spanish military, and they weren't living lives that upheld the tenets of the Catholic faith. And so for the native people from the Caribbean and Central and South America, they were being abused by the Spanish military. And so that put a big damper on the Crown's goal of catechesis. So based on the teaching and the development of the new evangelization by Bishop Las Casas and Father Luis de Cancer, two phenomenal Dominicans,
Right.
who looked at the catechesis of Central and South America and said, how can we fix this? How can we bring the beautiful story of God sending his son into the world and offer the fullness of faith to these native people without it being disrupted? So they came up with a system where priests would have to learn the language, the culture, and the currency or the value system of a culture before they went out to evangelize. And the fourth vow was, or the fourth tenet was, that the priests had to be willing to go into the wilderness one or two at a time without military presence to bring the word of God. So that was the main focus for Spain in coming to La Florida. There were some hiccups with that, unfortunately, because some of the earlier expeditions, if you will, that came into the west coast of Florida especially, did it without the authorization of the Crown, and they were abusive to the Indians. So we see that the natives on the west coast were a little sensitized.
I can imagine why. When in the research I've done, you picture yourself as a 19 to 30-year-old conquistador, and you have nothing to do but guard a bunch of upright logs, basically a fort in the middle of nowhere, and maybe you're not that well formed yourself, maybe you're not that great of a Christian, maybe you're just a nominal Christian, and it's understandable. Young men and boredom it's not a good healthy mix. But what I want to for the
or the fact that still so many of them were under the premonition or the misconception that there was gold and jewels in Florida too.
Sure, but what I also want to draw out is the fact that for the Spaniards, to a lesser degree the French, but not to any degree the English, evangelization of native populations, bringing souls to Christ, doing the Great Commission of Matthew 28, go out and make disciples of all
nations.
That was a huge focus for the Spanish Crown, for the Spanish rulers, the governors, etc. And like I said, for a little bit, to a lesser extent, but it was still there for the French up in Canada, but not at all for the English. Is
right, exactly. And who wrote the history books?
Exactly.
The English. I know, that's what's so beautiful. In La Florida, as the mission chain developed and as more and more individual villages went through the process of becoming a doctrina or a place of learning, and then went on to conversion and becoming a mission, as this process unfolded, we see more and more documentation where the chiefs, whether they were a cacica, a female chief, or a cacique, a male chief, where when they were elected or installed as the chief of a village, the king of Spain would send a scepter to the new chief to recognize his authority over his own people.
That's really interesting.
So there wasn't this feeling that from Spain in La Florida that we're going to go in and we're going to colonize these people and we're going to have them live the Spanish way. The goal was true enculturation. We're going to go to these people in their lands and offer them the fullness of faith. And I think that's why the catechesis in Florida was so successful, because the Spanish, the Jesuits, the Franciscans, especially the Franciscans, did not come in with this idea of changing the native culture. They came in after learning the culture with the idea of let's help bring their spirituality to a fullness. And that's what Catholicism is. It's the fullness of faith. So these people were never put on edge or were told that how they believe is wrong, because for centuries, if you grew up in a civilization that was never exposed to Jesus Christ, how are you going to relate to your creator? The best you can in the ways that he finds to communicate with you. But every human heart is created knowing they were created by someone outside of themselves who loves them dearly. I mean, that's in every human heart. And so for the native people who developed their spirituality over thousands of years, they believed in a creator God. But now all of a sudden you have men coming in and sharing the news that God sent his son into the world as a human. And now you can relate to your creator as a human. I mean, that must have just opened so many eyes and so many hearts. And we see that happening in La Florida. So that was the goal.
And which is, I kind of find myself jealous of the time, because that would be for, the two realms of normal human life, shall we say, to work hand in hand in that respect is a wonderful thing. And we know from Peru and places like this, it wasn't always perfectly carried out. The Spaniards carried on an illicit, illegal slave trade. That is, the people who were on the ground, the Spanish royalty, the Spanish crown wanted nothing to do with slavery. But nonetheless, to have that at least as the ideal, the framework from which.
Right.
Fantastic. Now, the first martyr in Florida is Father Luis de Cancer. And from what my research has told
with his colleagues, right.
Right. They were told, do not go to the western coast of Florida. You're to go to the eastern coast. And whether the pilot ignored the captain's orders, we don't know why. It's from,
right. But we think it's pilot error.
Okay, so they get to the west coast of Florida. And given what you've just said not too long ago about what the Spanish soldiers have done on the west coast of Florida, it sort of meets with predictable results, doesn't it?
Exactly.
So tell us a little bit more about Father Cancer. Well,
for me, Father Cancer, or Luis de Cancer, depending on your pronunciation, he worked hand in hand with Bishop Las Casas to develop this new evangelization. And his goal, after having met with success in the Yucatan Peninsula, his goal was to take this new evangelization and apply it in La Florida. That was his sole goal, but he never got a chance to realize that, because he was martyred shortly after stepping off the boat. Two of the lay brothers who had been martyred the day before when they were put ashore. So It's a sad chapter for us because he was such an amazing applied theologian, especially in the field of evangelization. But he is recognized as our prototype, if you will, Dominican martyr.
Excellent. So after Father Cancer, then what happens?
Well, then we have a little lull. We have the East Coast, 1565. Father Cancer's martyrdom was in 1549. So 1565, on the Feast of the Nativity of Our Lady, we have the founding of St. Augustine, first parish in the United States, first parish church, not the site of the first Mass, but the site of the first and longest parish Mass in the longest city. When the unique thing is when Menendez landed, the first thing he did was kneel down, kiss the cross, and kiss the robes of Father Lopez. And for the Timucua people in the city of Saloy, who were very intelligent, this to them struck a chord with the sacred, and they followed suit. They did this, they imitated Menendez in what he did.
Wow.
They participated in that first Mass, and they celebrated in that first Thanksgiving dinner. And it was a true thanksgiving to the Lord for having brought Menendez and his men safely to a harbor and to a welcoming city. The Timucua were welcoming at the time. The Timucua people, unlike the portrayals of the British as to Native Americans, the Timucua people were brilliant. They were phenomenal linguists. They had a written language. They were the center of commerce and trade because in the area of Saloy, which we now know as St. Augustine, they had the right mixture of limestone and oyster shell, and they would mix that and set it on fire. They would get a very high dry heat, so they could dry meat, so fish and fowl and deer, and so they had quite an extensive export system, if you will, already established. And in order to be a good export city, you have to be good linguists. Excuse me. So within 4 months of the Spanish landing, we know that the Timucua had already learned Spanish and were already reading and writing in Spanish. And then when one of our Franciscans, Father Parga, landed later on in the late 1500s, and he began to translate the Catechism of the Catholic Church from Spanish into Timucua, we know that the Timucua got tired of waiting for his translation, and they took it over and finished the translation themselves.
That's
so, you know, it was just, to me, it's amazing. The Appalachians, we know that when they heard that the Franciscans were coming out into the wilderness to bring the word of God, they would go out along these established trails and would erect huge crosses to try to attract the priests to come to their village and share this knowledge of the one true God and his son. So it was we just don't have anything else in our American history that shows this loving, beautiful way that the sharing of Christianity happened. We have some documentation that shows that a village that chose not to convert to Catholicism lived in peace and harmony right next to a village that did choose to live as a Christian village. You know, they would go from, the chiefs would ask the priests to come in and evangelize. And during that period, the village became known as a doctrina. And as they were catechized, it would come to a point where both the priests and the chief felt that the family, the village, was ready for conversion. Now, one of the main goals of conversion was for the village to become known as a mission and be able to build a church. But there weren't enough priests to go around. So why was this so important for the Native people? Because once you were declared a mission and granted that title by the provincial in St. Augustine, the Franciscan provincial, you could have a tabernacle and Christ could live with you 24/7. You had Christ in your midst in the form of the Eucharist. And the native people understood this completely. They lived with Jesus. It wasn't just a symbol to them. He actually lived within their village. And it's so beautiful. There's one story of one of the priests who's out walking in the wilderness, and he wanted to know, the saying was, if you wanted to know if an Indian that was approaching you was Christian or not, you would yell out, "Hey, do you know Jesus?" And the native people would yell back, "Jesus? Sure, we know him, Mary's boy." So there was this beautiful relationship that the natives had that was totally physical and totally spiritual, which for me is the beauty of Native American Catholicism, because
Yes.
you have all the tangibility of the West with all the mysticism of the Orient, and you have who we were created to be. You know, our created perfected state is mind, body, and soul together, not soul separated from the physical body. And so how these native people accepted Christ into their midst, accepted Mary as the mother of God and as their mother too. It was just amazing.
It doesn't surprise me given the experience of the Algonquins and the other Christians who were remarkable, who put us to shame to this day, if you know their stories. And so it's fantastic to hear.
And that's just it. You can't talk about martyrs and true martyrdom till you understand the evangelization and how they lived their Catholic life. That evangelization had to be so pervasive through the entire human person that they would be willing, given many opportunities to deny their Christian faith and live, that they would say, no, I cannot deny Jesus Christ. The cross is my heart. And for me to deny the cross would be like me killing myself. That's one of the quotes from one of the caciques who was martyred. She was told to spit on the cross and she could live. And she said, how can I do that? My heart and the cross are one. For me to do that, it would be like me killing myself.
Oh, wow. So the Dominicans make their attempt at evangelization, doesn't go so well.
Correct.
Then the Jesuits,
right.
Tell us a little bit about that experience.
Well, the Jesuit, there's two martyrdom events concerning Jesuits. The first one is in right outside of Jacksonville, North Jacksonville, Mayport, Florida, and that was Father Pedro Martinez. He was a phenomenal theologian. He was well known in Spain as a Jesuit orator and lecturer, academia, and he got in his heart that he wanted to travel to the New World and evangelize these new peoples. And the Jesuit leader of the order at the time was St. Francis Borgia, and he kept trying to put him off because his value in the theological academic world was so great that he didn't want to lose him to the wilderness. But eventually he relented. What we know about him, we don't know a lot about his actual landing in Florida because he was killed very shortly after arriving in Florida, martyred.
Okay.
But what we do know is what the captain of the Danish boat wrote, the boats that transported him over to Florida. And they said that his ability to catechize the sailors, he would turn sailors from sinners into saints. That's how good he was. And everyone was confessing, and he just had this magnetic effect upon the sailors on the ships. A group of the sailors was sent ashore to collect water, and we know that he requested to go with them, and he had met some of the native people, but at this time we have to remember where they landed was in the French Huguenot area, And the French Huguenots had already sensitized some of these saltwater Timucuans against Catholicism in general. And so when he landed, one of the early encounters that he had, he ended up being martyred.
And we should clarify for our viewers that French Huguenots, it's basically French Calvinists. So
right.
very,
Correct. Correct.
Very anti-Catholic and that sort of thing.
Schisms, the Reformation, right. There was so much anti-Catholic sentiment. You know, for France was divided. There was Catholic France and there was the Calvinistic part of France. Britain, under King Henry VIII, had completely tried to squash the Catholic Church in England. So the English were not very friendly toward Catholics at all either. But it's very interesting that the short stay that the French Calvinists had in the Jacksonville area was enough to sensitize some of the natives in the early formation of the Spanish mission chain. That eventually dissolved over time, which was very good for evangelization, but it didn't help Father Pedro.
Unfortunately. So, but didn't the Jesuits also try to evangelize the area around what we now call the Chesapeake Bay, except they called it the Bay of Our Lady, La Bahia de
Right. Mm-hmm.
So what about that a little bit?
Well, and that one, that was a group of 2 or 3 Jesuit priests and brothers who were escorted by a native of that area that they had met along their traveling north from St. Augustine to evangelize. And this particular native was taking them back to his village under the pretense of coming to evangelize and to spread the gospel. This native had been captured somewhere. We don't know the whole story on him yet. Long story short, the Jesuits got there. They had set up a larger mission with several little outposts. And this very same Indian who brought them to that area to evangelize also stirred up the other natives to rise up and to martyr these Jesuits.
It almost seems like he didn't want, although he had been taken as a youth to learn about Spanish ways and customs and receive baptism, it doesn't sound like it really ever took with him. And he said, yeah, I'll help you go evangelize these people, but really
right.
He's just looking for a way back home. It seems to me.
Right. And that's what, I mean, we're still trying to get more information on this particular event. So there aren't a lot of the Jesuit, proceedings and whatnot, because none of them survived. And so this is going to be a little more difficult to put together the whole picture.
So this experience, this is the sort of experience that convinces the Jesuits that the La Florida mission fields, it's not something in which they want to invest their time. So
correct. Or their lives.
Or their lives, yes, costing them greatly in number of lives lost. So I'm imagining, so this is where the Franciscans come in. The Franciscans say,
correct.
We'll give it a shot. What about,
right.
How did they come to the La Florida and what sort of impact and experiences did they have?
I think the Franciscans who came, now the Spanish Franciscans, we have to remember, came from everywhere. They came from Mexico, from Cuba, from Spain itself. So La Florida attracted Franciscan missionaries from all over the Spanish Empire. And I think that why it worked out so well for the Franciscans is because they adhered to the Dominican new evangelization process of learning the culture, the language, the value system, and to be willing to go out without military escort. And I think that was kind of their toehold in the Florida mission chain. They were non-threatening. They were met for the most part with open arms. Plus, they didn't, for the most part, they traveled to areas that had not encountered other Europeans. And that seems to be the hinge point, if you will, for their evangelization.
Excellent. And so what kind of experiences did they have in terms of the reception that they received for the faith, the willingness of the native peoples, the indigenous, to accept the teachings of the faith and that sort of thing?
Well, I mean, it spanned several hundred, from 1570s, 1580s up until 1762. So we're talking about a long period of time. And when we summarize that, it makes it seem like it all happened at once, but it didn't. It happened slowly and over time. There was one major uprising among the Indians against the Franciscans, and that's called the Gwali Uprising of 1597. And it's very interesting because the Franciscans had established 6 very active missions along the Georgia-Florida coast, what we would call today the Georgia Isles. And the conversions were happening. It was going very well, but one Indian chief in particular, and then one sub-chief, were very upset about this concept of monogamy. Because for the chiefs in the Gwali, they were allowed to have more than one wife. Okay. Now, the majority of the chiefs, they were fine with that because they were following the tenets of this Catholic faith, and they were being evangelized step by step. So they understood why this was important, to give your life fully only to one person. Mm-hmm. But this particular chief was not real happy about it, and he would manage to stir up all of the villages, and over a period of a few days, they managed to burn all the mission churches, kill 5 of the 6 priests. The 6th priest was badly beaten, but his Christian converts rescued him and got him to St. Augustine. He invoked, clerical secrecy. He would not divulge who was responsible. So the lieutenant governor, he decided that, unlike the British that would have probably gone in and just decimated these tribes in retaliation, the Spanish lieutenant governor he sent a messenger to all 6 of the chiefs and said, if you will send me who is responsible for these murders, these killings, we will have a trial and we'll merit out justice. And the chiefs got together and they thought, that's a good thing. That's the right thing to do. So they themselves brought these 2 particular gentlemen to St. Augustine. A trial was held. They were hung, and that was the end of it. Now that was in 1597. 6 missions burned to the ground, no priest there to evangelize. For 20 years, less than 20 years, from 1597 to 1606, these people were writing to St. Augustine, begging for the province to send them more priests. They had rebuilt the missions. They were begging for the priests to bring the Eucharist back.
Isn't that something? Wow. And
then in 1606, when Bishop Altamirano made his first Episcopal visit from Cuba, and he went through that area, those 6 missions, he confirmed over 3,500 Native Americans. It was just 350 alone from those 6 missions. And he was just amazed at the depth of their faith, that it was a truly lived belief in Jesus Christ, belief in the real presence of the Eucharist. His secretary, if you will, Father Ferrer de Andrade, Vincent Ferrer de Andrade, he was a Dominican priest, but after the 4-month tour of the missions of La Florida with Bishop Altamirano, he asked to be released from his Dominican vows And he entered the Franciscan seminary in St. Augustine and became a Franciscan missionary to the different missions within La Florida, because he fell so in love with these people and how they lived their faith.
Isn't that beautiful? And it makes, it's the sort of impact that we're hoping that John Paul II's new evangelization will have, was that people just be on fire. And it was the purpose for calling the Second Vatican Council, that people would be just passionate about their faith and have it and live to be saints, which it sounds like these people are doing. So the Franciscans are enjoying a lot more success than their Jesuit and Dominican confreres. Is that the case?
That's the case, correct.
So tell us a little bit more about how they came to spread the missions, not just on the East Coast of Florida, throughout the Panhandle, what we now know as the Panhandle.
Right. Well, the Franciscans were amazing catechists, but they also took full advantage, if you will, of the native people themselves who wanted to become catechists. I mean, these were intelligent people. And for example, our prototype martyr, Antonio Quipa, who was an Appalachian chief, and was his mission San Luis, was right outside of Tallahassee, Florida. And he would go to villages on his own to catechize, to teach about God's only Son. He would make flutes and play the music that the Spaniards had taught him, the hymns and everything, and he would play that and sing the hymns and be invited into villages that maybe the Franciscans wouldn't have been invited into.
Okay.
There's some documents that describe that he was allowed to read the gospel from the lectern at times.
No kidding.
And I don't know if that was in the context of a mass or was that in the context of just educating and preaching. But
Sure.
he was responsible for the conversion of several thousand native people in the Panhandle area. He came to St. Augustine in 1703 to the shrine of Our Lady of La Leche in order to write his last will and testament. A lot of the chiefs would do that so that they could have their last will and testaments notarized in an ecclesiastical court and a secular court so that it could be a valid last will and testament. Antonio's last will and testament is one of the most beautiful things I've ever read. It reads like the creed. He writes about what he believes in, why he believes in the presence of Christ in the Eucharist. He's thankful to his parents who were converts to the Catholic faith and raised him in the Catholic faith. He talks about his wife, his two children. He leaves money and lands for them. He leaves money and lands for the people of his village. He leaves money for the Franciscans. He asks to be buried in a Franciscan habit.
Wow.
Which the Franciscans, after reading his last will and testament, gave that to him right away. I mean, it was so beautiful. But he does something in one of the last paragraphs of his will that I find just totally brilliant. I had to go change my will. He leaves enough money so that 50 masses will be said for his soul when he dies.
No kidding.
Talk about an insurance policy. I mean, that is brilliant. That to me speaks to the depth of catechesis that these people received, had, and lived.
If you ever go to Rome and you're walking around some of these churches and you see these huge sepulchral monuments, or even just cenotaphs to these very wealthy and notable Romans of ages past, a lot of the times what you find is that not only did they want this cenotaph to be placed there or for them to be buried in these huge ornate tombs, they paid to have a mass said for themselves each and every day in perpetuity over the centuries. And so what you're finding with some rare and very wealthy people in Europe, you're finding amongst this newly evangelized peoples here on the continent of North America. That's just fantastic. The other thing that strikes me is that in listening to you talk, and thank you for giving us this amazing information, is that our forefathers in the faith, the missionaries in French Canada and in what is now the northern part of the United States, had a very, except in certain places like amongst the Wabanaki in Maine, had a very difficult time evangelizing the Algonquin, Huron, the Kickapoo, and things like this, because the worldview was just so completely different. And one of the people that I write about in the book, Father Gabriel de la Rebourde, he talks about how it's just, this is impossible. In fact, he was on his way back to the French settlement because he just found it pointless to try any more when he was martyred. Mm-hmm. Saying, you're telling us that there was a huge amount of receptivity on the part of the natives, the indigenous in La Florida, to the gospel. Why do you think that was? What do you, based on your knowledge of the Algonquin and the Huron and the Mohawk mm-hmm. Confederacy, and then the natives down in La Florida, what accounts for that difference?
Well, I think the fact that they were valued and respected with the infinite value of the human person. They weren't sub-persons. They weren't subjected to the crown per se. They were recognized as unique and individuals within their own right. And if the Spanish, like, for example, there's a story of a Spanish soldier who slapped a 10-year-old Appalachian boy because he was being loud outside. He was running around and the soldier told him to be quiet. And the little boy's outside. He's running around, he's yelling, he's screaming, and the soldier slapped him. He's 10 years old. The soldier slapped him. Well, the little boy went to his parents. His parents went to the chief of the village, and the chief of the village, he pulled the soldier up and he said, "Why did you slap this boy?" And, the soldier told him why. He said, "Do you not realize that you slapped Christ? That Christ is in this boy?" And the soldier wouldn't recant. He wouldn't apologize. So the chief wrote a letter to the King of Spain and explained the situation. The king wrote back expressing his apologies. He demoted the soldier, which meant he lost 3 months of pay and was demoted to a lower rank and was removed from La Florida and sent back to Spain. With that kind of support coming from the King of Spain to the chiefs of the villages, these people knew that their citizenship and their value for who they were was being respected.
It's a fantastic point that we need to to recognize to this day, and it's different than what we might find in other parts of New Spain, unfortunately. So this wasn't a uniform sort of thing. For instance, if you ever go to the amazing town of Cholula, which was kind of a spiritual epicenter, kind of, if you will, a Mesoamerican Vatican, Holy See, whatever, for the pagan Indians living in Mexico, you're going to see this incredible, beautiful, huge church. And right next to it, right abutting it, brick to brick, is a smaller church. And it's because the people who worshiped in the large church, the Spaniards, would not worship with the Indians who came to the faith. So what you're seeing in Florida is a completely different dynamic, and one that's obviously well welcomed. It's the same thing was with the French. The French did not have this kind of separation either. So
it's interesting in the, we have several of the first books of the first parish. We were able, Bishop Varro, the first bishop of the Diocese of St. Augustine when we were part of the United States, he had requested from Cuba over and over and over again, because all of these books had been removed from Florida when Florida was seceded to Britain in 1763. And we finally got them 4 of the original books back in 1923. And it's very interesting because if you look at the log entries in the first Spanish period, they just have the names and who married who and who was baptized and who did this. There's no like discriminatory distinction between who is Spanish and who is Indian. But then when we fast forward to the second Spanish period, which is 1783 up to 1821, when we fast forward that, the books are separate. You have a white and a non-white book where the registry is of baptisms and marriages, and you have more of this description of this Spaniard married, this whatever, and there's so much more segregation put into this, whereas in the first books there's no delineation.
it's really remarkable. What was the experience of the missions and the Franciscans with the English on the other side of the border, the South Carolina
Well,
and then Georgia?
That experience is what brought about the end of the Florida mission chain.
Really? Tell us more.
When the British landed, they came with the hopes of finding gold and gems and everything. And when they didn't find that from an economic perspective, they had to change gears and figure out a way to make these expeditions more economical. When they first arrived in Jamestown, Yorktown area, they had quite a few indentured servants, prisoners, and things like that they could use for basically slave labor. So they began an agricultural economy. As they ran out of or couldn't transport, British indentured servants, if you will, then they started to expand to the enslavement of Native people. And this is where it started. The British on the southeastern coast of the United States befriended the Creek and the Yamasee warriors, gave them lots of alcohol, gave them guns, and taught them how to enslave their own, cousins, if you will, Native people. After they kind of went through the Carolinas and Virginia and northern Georgia, they tried to venture into La Florida, but they were met with a lot of resistance because the majority of natives had been catechized. They realized that they were an equal with any other human on the face of the earth, and that they had an infinite value in the eyes of God, and they couldn't be enslaved. Plus, they also knew that the British did not have the sacraments, and they were not going to leave Christ in the tabernacle or in the Eucharist. And so the British found it very difficult to enslave the Native people that were catechized. So they went about a whole military philosophy of fear tactics, basically. And they would go into a mission, they would burn down the chapel, they would try to round up the priests, the sacristans, the chief, and any of the natives that they captured, they would force to watch these very prolonged martyrdoms, these very prolonged tortures, because they wanted to strike fear into the hearts of these catechized Indians. But over the long haul, it backfired on them, because these Native people were so well catechized that they refused to deny their faith in Jesus Christ. There's one story of a particular cacica who she was rounded up with 49 of her warriors, and she refused to renounce her faith despite the British and the Creek saying, if you renounce your faith, if you spit on the cross, if you trample the cross, we'll set you free. You'll still become a slave, but your life will be spared. And of the 49 warriors that were forced to watch her martyrdom and then were given the choice, 39 of them refused to denounce their faith.
Wow.
That's huge catechesis.
Yes, absolutely. It reminds me of the Martyrs of Otranto. Same sort of thing. Muslims came and said, yeah, you're still going to be a slave, but at least you'll have your head. And the men
Right.
in the city, to a man, said no. And each one of them were decapitated. So it's a remarkable thing. But there were, one of the priests you were talking about before, I want to say Juan de Parga?
Father Parga. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Father Parga. So he was actually burnt at the stake by the British, wasn't he?
He was, yes. He was captured defending his mission with his other natives against the British.
And all they had to defend themselves were some arrows, right?
Yeah, because Spain did not outfit the native people with guns and no alcohol at all was in La Florida from Spain, because they saw what had happened in Central and South America when native people were, brought into that culture, so to speak.
Okay.
And the kings, if you read some of their memoirs, agonized over this all the time. Should we
Really?
have given guns to defend themselves? Should we have done this? And they agonized over it. So in the long run, they didn't ever do it. But, I don't know, would it have made a big difference? Probably not. But it is what it is. There's one quick martyrdom that I wanted to bring up with you, because it was of a mother and her son.
Okay, great. Please, yes.
This is a mother who was the wife of the chief. He was not in the village when her village was attacked, but she was the sacristan at the church along with her son. They were known as being very generous, very faith-filled. They prayed the rosary together all the time and would invite others to pray with them. So Our Lady of the Rosary was huge for the native people here. And when the British and the Creeks came in and rounded her up, of course, being the highest ranking official, she and her son were going to be, the ones that were going to be tortured and martyred in front of the captured Indians. What happened was they tied both of them to stakes facing each other, and they started to pray the rosary together. And they told the mother, Mariana, that if she would renounce her faith, her son would live. Now, in today's world, that would cause people to stop and come up with a faulty logic that would say, well, if I don't denounce my faith, my son is going to die. Therefore, I have killed my son. So I have to denounce my faith. There's a faulty relative logic that exists today. But Mariana, looking into her son's eyes, said, I cannot denounce my faith. Everything I would have taught my son would be for naught if I denounce my faith today. And so the two of them were praying, looking into each other's eyes. They set her son on fire and they clubbed him, and she had to watch him die. After he died, they gave her a second chance, thinking that the horror of watching her son's death would change her. And she refused to change. And so she had a fire lit under her, and she was clubbed to death, and both of their bodies were left for the wild animals at the end. And so I bring that up because to me, there are so many people today who would take their faith, their belief in God, and they would make it more relative. Like, okay, well, it's kind of like in that Kingdom Come movie, where they say, convert to Islam today, repent tomorrow. It's like, no. That's not living the faith. That's not being a witness to Jesus Christ. And for me, one of the most important things is why is Pontius Pilate in the creed? He's the only other human besides Our Lady who's mentioned in our creed. And I think that's because he asked Christ the most important question. He didn't say, do you have a kingdom? He said, where is your kingdom? And Christ said, my kingdom is not of this world, but there's a pause. Yet, if my kingdom were of this world, my followers would be fighting to save me. And when we say the Our Father and we say that come, what we're saying is that we are willing to defend Christ at all costs.
Beautiful. You make a great point. And as I'm listening to the story you've just recounted, it reminds me of the story of the Maccabees, and their mother and her exhorting her children to remain faithful even unto death. So it's or the story, we find it in Maccabees, rather, I should say.
Well, for me, the story of the Florida Martyrs is the greatest defense of the real presence of the Eucharist in U.S. history. And the more their story gets out and the more people understand it, I think that the doubt around the real presence will start to dissolve.
Quick question. In the past, the Virginia Martyrs, the Jesuits up in Virginia, and the Georgia Martyrs, they were kind of separate beatification causes. Now with the onset of Martyrs of La Florida and South, right. Oh, I didn't even know about South Carolina. Okay, so has that all been joined into one cause?
In this past year, all of the bishops of the different dioceses that have martyrs under the umbrella of the Martyrs of La Florida, so that would be Mobile, Alabama, Savannah, Georgia, Charleston, South Carolina, Richmond, Virginia, plus all the bishops of Florida itself. Everyone has signed their competency over to Bishop Wachs, the Bishop of Tallahassee, Pensacola.
It makes perfect sense, especially given the fact that, it was all considered part of Florida at the time. Where can people go to learn more about this? If, this is what their appetite, they want to learn more, where do they go? What do they do?
They go to the website, Martyrs of La Florida. And you'll be able to pull up brief descriptions of all 60 plus martyrdom events. We have a graphic novel out now that took us almost 2 years to write, to have everything accurate, including the dress, including the language, everything, and that's out now. And then just to come and visit and get it, and let me see, 1, 2, 3 of us are in Florida and always ready and willing to help pilgrims and people who are interested understand more of the Martyrs of La Florida. In our diocese, our Bishop Esteves, has just started a spiritual adoption program where every parish is adopting one martyrdom event from within our diocese. And they're going to spend this next year in prayer and learning it and rise to our own faith today.
Awesome. Dr. Mary Soha, thank you so much for spending some time with us this afternoon and for helping us to know more about these incredible figures who are such examples for us and will certainly inspire a lot of other people to draw a person closer to the person of Jesus Christ through Our Lady. So thank you very much. I really appreciate you being with us.
Yes, you're welcome. All right, thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for joining us for yet another episode of That Catholic Saint Sky. I'm Brian O'Neill. If you like what you're seeing, please go ahead and click that little subscribe button. Click the little bell so that you can be notified automatically when new videos are posted. And please hit that like and thumbs up button, send it, share it along, and we will see you next time.